The sun was tired when he found them, tired like the bones of the earth, aching under the weight of what had been done. A dusty wind carried whispers across the plain, not loud enough to be speech, not soft enough to forget. The cowboy rode through it with his head lowered, his hat casting a long shadow over eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. His name wasn't known in many places, and where it wasn't remembered with affection or fear. Only a quiet nod, the kind given to men who keep to themselves and don't ask more of the world than it's willing to give. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Just the mule, and it never answered back. Not that he expected it to. The weight of silence was something he carried better than conversation. Since the winter his wife died, words had turned brittle in his throat, crumbling when he tried to use them. It was easier to live among creaking floorboards, wind-blown fence posts, and the soft snort of an animal that never asked why he slept with his boots on or why the bed on the right side of the cabin stayed untouched. He hadn't meant to come this way. The old trail twisted strangely today, guiding him like a memory he couldn't place. And there, just over the ridge where the hills sank into themselves, he saw it. A wagon. Empty at first glance. Tipped like a dead beetle, wheels half sunk into the red earth. Buzzards circled above, but they hadn't landed. That meant something was still alive. He dismounted slow. Dust coughed up around his boots as he stepped toward it, revolver in hand, but loose at the side. The silence felt unnatural, not fearful, but expectant. When he reached the back of the wagon, the sight stopped him clean. 4 girls. Tied like cattle, ankles and wrists raw from rope. Each of them thin, too thin, with bruises like brush marks on canvas skin. They didn't cry out. Didn't flinch. Just looked at him, eyes dry but hollow, like the tears had run out a long time ago. The oldest looked 25, maybe less. Her gaze met his without blinking, daring him to turn away like all the others had. One hand protected the girl beside her, younger, maybe 22, her face half hidden behind a torn sleeve and tangled black hair. The other 2 were younger still, barely grown. One held a cracked music box in her lap, fingers wrapped tight around it as if it were the last piece of her life not stolen. They didn't speak English. He didn't speak their tongue. But something passed between them. Not language, understanding. Pain recognized pain, even across silence. He crouched slowly, careful not to spook them. Their eyes tracked every motion. He saw how the rope bit into their flesh, how the wagon wheel they were bound to had dried blood where someone had tried to struggle. His jaw clenched. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even cruelty. It was neglect wearing the skin of law. He looked around. No horses. No tracks that didn't already blend into the wind. Whoever left them had gone long enough ago that no one would be coming back. Not for them. He pulled his knife from his boot. The girls stiffened. The youngest whimpered, just once, soft and high, like a bird hit mid-flight. He stopped. Raised his free hand. Then, slowly, wordlessly, he reached down and began to saw at the rope. It took time. The knots were cruel, made to stay. But one by one, he freed them. The oldest never broke eye contact. The quiet one, second oldest, looked at his hands, not his face. When the last knot fell, none of them moved. They just sat there, staring at their own wrists, like they couldn't believe it was real. He stood. Nodded toward his mule. They hesitated. Who could blame them? One white man traded them. Another found them. Why should this one be different? But the quiet one stood first. She placed her hand against the side of the wagon, steadying herself. The others followed. No words passed. Just motion. Trust not given, but borrowed, just enough to walk away. He gave them water. Dried meat from his pack. Watched as they ate like people who'd forgotten what chewing felt like. They didn't ask who he was. He didn't ask where they came from. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows grew long, he looked at the road ahead. It would be a longer ride now. Slower. But something in his chest felt steadier than it had in years. He helped the smallest girl onto the mule. The others walked beside. As they traveled, the youngest began to hum. Her fingers turned the crank of the broken music box, though no sound came. Still, the motion mattered. Maybe someday the sound would come again. The cowboy didn't know why he did it. He only knew the dust didn't settle like it used to, and the road ahead was no longer empty. Night fell. Coyotes howled far off. The prairie wind moved through the grass like a hand over quiet piano keys. Behind him, he heard footsteps keeping pace. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. In that silence, heavy but not hollow, the story began, not loud, not sudden, but like the first breath after almost drowning. The cabin sat quiet in the crook of a sun-baked hill, its roof sagging under the years but still holding firm against wind and memory. It was a place built by hands now long gone, hands that once braided bread, stroked a banjo's strings, tucked notes into coat pockets with lips pressed to cheeks in passing. The cow hadn't moved much inside since she died. The bed was still made on one side. Her shawl still hung on the peg by the hearth. He couldn't bring himself to sweep it all away. Now 4 strangers stood inside that hollow space, changing it with nothing more than their presence. The girls stepped through the door with caution, like walking into a dream they didn't trust. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and pine resin. The walls bore nail marks where photos once hung. It was not a place made for women, not anymore. But they moved gently, their silence like soft breath under the floorboards. He gave them the bedroom. Took to the loft himself. Rolled out an old buffalo hide and lay there in the dark, boots off but gun near, listening to the whisper of unfamiliar feet on worn wood. The eldest girl, stern and watchful, took it upon herself to map the new space. She learned quickly where the water bucket sat, where the firewood was stacked, where the kettle whistled hardest. She never smiled, but she never stumbled either. Her posture remained upright, even as her hands scrubbed pans or sorted through dried beans. She did not trust the world enough to relax. The youngest clung to the others, especially to the girl with the music box. Her laughter came rarely, but when it did, it startled even the birds from their branches. She would sometimes sit on the porch steps at dusk and trace the patterns in the wood with her fingers, humming to herself in a language the cowboy didn't know, but felt he'd heard in a dream once, long ago. But it was the quiet one, the second eldest, who caught his notice in ways he couldn't explain. She didn't command the space. She didn't laugh or bark orders. She simply existed in stillness, moving like wind over a lake, almost invisible, but always present. She rose with the sun. Helped with the horses. Cleaned without being asked. Her hair was always tied back, except when the wind pulled it loose and it framed her face like black silk. Her eyes carried the kind of silence that didn't demand answers but made you want to give them anyway. She watched him work, curious but cautious. He taught her how to mend a harness with gestures and quiet nods. She mimicked his movements with surprising grace. Once, her fingers brushed his as they reached for the same tool. Neither spoke. But that small touch hung in the space between them like smoke, curling and vanishing, but not forgotten. Days blurred into each other. They ate together in the soft candlelight of early spring evenings. The girls whispered among themselves in soft tones, sometimes glancing at him, but never mocking, never fearful. He caught fragments of their names, but never dared repeat them out loud for fear of getting them wrong. He didn't want to own them. He just wanted to understand. In town, the wind carried talk. A man who took in foreign girls. A man alone in the hills with 4 shadows. Some said he was cursed. Others said worse. He didn't answer them. He stopped going into the saloon. He bought supplies quickly and rode home before the dusk could pull words from mean mouths. The girls noticed, even if they didn't speak it. One evening, as he stacked wood beside the cabin, the quiet one approached with a bowl of stew. She held it out with both hands, eyes lowered. When he reached for it, she looked up, just once. There was no fear in her gaze. Only clarity. He accepted the bowl with a nod and something inside him shifted, almost painfully. That night, he sat longer by the fire. Listened to the creak of the rafters. Thought about what it meant to carry other people's ghosts alongside your own. He had buried love before. But this wasn't love, not yet. It was something earlier, smaller, and more sacred. A sense of being seen. Of being safe. The youngest began drawing pictures in the dust outside, shapes of birds, horses, trees. He watched her sometimes and began to recognize them. He remembered how his wife once wanted children. They'd come close once, but the child hadn't stayed. After that, the silence became permanent between them, like a field left fallow for too long. One morning, the quiet girl stood by the corral, holding a rope like she wanted to learn how to lead the mare. He showed her, gently, with slow steps and even slower words. She followed his movements, her touch light on the horse's neck. When the animal nudged her shoulder, she smiled. He hadn't seen her smile before. It wasn't wide or showy, it was barely there. But it broke something in him he hadn't realized was still frozen. That evening, she placed the broken music box on the table beside his tin cup. She tapped the side gently, then pointed to the crank. He turned it, expecting nothing. But a faint chime escaped, just one note, barely alive. She watched his face as it happened. He didn't speak. He didn't know how to say what it felt like spring thaw cracking the surface of a frozen lake. In the following days, they fell into rhythm, not as family, not yet, but something like the outline of one. The cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire. The space she left behind, his wife, didn't feel smaller. It just felt shared. One afternoon, the quiet girl sat on the porch steps as he returned from a hunt. Her sleeves were rolled, and her hair unbound. The breeze played with it, tugging strands into her face. She didn't move them. Just looked at him with a steadiness that didn't demand anything, only offered the truth of her being there. He tipped his hat. She nodded once, then returned to her sewing. Inside, the stew was already simmering. He felt no fear. Only the weight of something real, waiting to bloom. And yet, the air was changing. Far off, the sky grew heavy with clouds not made of rain, but of men's words, and the threat of things left unresolved. Still, in that moment, the world held still. And for the first time in many winters, the cowboy thought maybe it might stay that way. The air turned softer in spring. The nights still carried a bite, but by morning, the light slipped in through the cabin's windows like honey. Days grew longer, gentler. Trees that had stood naked all winter stretched tentative fingers into leaf again. The apricot tree by the cabin, once dry as bone, began to bud. It bloomed shyly at first, a few white blossoms like quiet promises. Then, one morning, it exploded into bloom, as though all the waiting had finally broken into song. The cowboy noticed the change before he admitted it. The girls were laughing more now. The youngest chased the chickens with the wild abandon of someone trying to recapture stolen time. The oldest let her soften, if only slightly, when she watched the others spin fabric by the porch. The house no longer felt like his alone. It felt occupied, alive. And that meant risk. But it also meant meaning. He worked beside the quiet girl more often now. She'd taken a liking to the animals, speaking to them in low, melodic tones. The mare responded to her the way it never had to him. Her voice was made for gentleness, but her hands were not afraid of work. One afternoon, as they mucked the stalls in silence, a horse kicked out in frustration. Instinctively, he stepped in front of her, arm outstretched, like a wall between her and the danger. She didn't flinch. Instead, she touched his wrist, lightly, without urgency, as if to say, "I'm all right." Her fingers lingered for a moment too long, then slipped away like mist. He didn't look at her, but his breath betrayed him, shallow, uneven. Later that night, she stayed by the fire after the others had gone to bed. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife, trying not to watch her fingers trace the carved edges of the old rocking chair. She glanced at him once, then looked at the flames. The room breathed with the quiet of something unsaid, but not unfelt. She spoke, gently, in halting English. "You, good man." He looked up. Surprise washed over him before settling into something steadier. He didn't know what to say, so he nodded. Then, with care, he replied, "You, safe here." A pause. She nodded, too. That was all. But it was enough. Sometimes, the simplest things were the heaviest. The following week, they began preparing a small garden patch. The ground was tough, and the spring rains late, but the girls threw themselves into it like it was a prayer. The quiet one planted ginger and mint from seeds she'd hidden in her sleeves since the wagon. He watched her pat the dirt down, reverently, as if coaxing memory into bloom. When he offered her a rusted old tin watering can, she smiled again, small, real. That smile became more frequent, though never careless. It arrived like sun through clouds, cautious but warm. She began humming as she worked. The tune was strange, unfamiliar. Foreign, yes, but it didn't feel far away. He found himself listening more than he meant to, hands idle, ears full. The music box began working again, faintly. A few broken notes spiraled out, crooked and soft. The youngest girl would crank it at dusk, dancing small circles in the dirt, while the others clapped in rhythm. One night, the quiet one sang to it. Her voice, thin, trembling, but determined, wrapped the porch in something tender. The cowboy stood just inside the doorway, out of sight, and listened. Her voice made him ache in places he had long forgotten how to feel. In town, the storm brewed slowly. Talk sharpened. Men at the saloon eyed him when he rode in for supplies. A few made jokes that didn't try to be quiet. Foreigners. Girls who didn't belong. Some wondered what he was doing out there in that cabin. Others said worse. He ignored it at first. Let them think what they wanted. But one morning, the storekeep handed him his sack with a warning in his eyes. Watch yourself, Sam. Some folks got it in their heads you're shelter in trouble. Sam didn't respond. Just paid and rode home, slower than before, the wind behind him full of voices he didn't want to remember. Back at the cabin, the girls greeted him like always, but he could feel the tension climbing into his bones. Something unspoken followed him now. Like a shadow that didn't belong to him. That night, he sat outside long after dark. The stars were thick above the roof. The quiet one came out without a sound and sat beside him on the steps, their shoulders almost touching. She didn't speak. Neither did he. After some time, she held out a small piece of cloth, worn, embroidered, folded tight. He took it slowly. Opened it. Inside was a pattern of blue cranes stitched into cream fabric. My mother, she said. Made for wedding. He held it as though it were glass. She looked ahead, not at him. No wedding. Taken. Sold. But I keep. He wanted to say something. Anything. But words are clumsy around wounds too deep to dress. So he handed it back, careful not to fold it wrongly. She didn't take it. Instead, she closed his fingers around it. I give. His chest felt tight. He hadn't asked for this. But some gifts arrive without request, because they're not meant to be owned, only honored. He tucked the cloth into his pocket, over his heart. She nodded, then stood and went inside. He remained there, watching the stars, feeling the shape of something new settle into him. In the days that followed, the air grew thick, not just with pollen, but with a sense that something was shifting. He saw it in the eyes of travelers passing his land. In the way even birds took off earlier than usual. In the quiet, stiff way the girls stood when they heard horses in the distance, uncertain whether to hope or hide. Still, within the walls of the cabin, life tried its best to remain ordinary. The apricot tree bore its first fruit. The garden sprouted green shoots. The music box no longer cried, only sang, albeit softly. And every night, when the fire died low and the porch creaked with memory, the cowboy sat with the cloth of blue cranes folded in his palm. He didn't know what lay ahead. But he knew he wouldn't turn away. Not this time. The wind changed before the trouble came. Not in its sound, but in its silence. Birds flew differently. The horses grew restless without cause. Even the apricot tree, heavy with green fruit, dropped one too many before its time. The cowboy noticed, though he said nothing. In the west, nature spoke first, long before men dared open their mouths. He'd gone into town for nails and kerosene. Just a quick trip, as always. He stayed out of the saloon now, bought what he needed, and left without waiting to be spoken to. But that day, voices followed him to the saddle. Should have sold them when he had the chance. Think he's keepin' one for himself? Only thing worse than a squatter's a white man with no pride. He didn't flinch. Not outside. But the heat behind his collar grew thick. He rode back faster than usual, not stopping to let the mule rest at the stream. His hand kept brushing the pocket where the embroidered cloth lay folded, worn now from nights of being held without knowing what to do with it. At the cabin, everything seemed untouched. The girls were gathering wild onions. The youngest was laughing about something that involved a grasshopper. The quiet one was by the corral, braiding strands of horsehair into a little cord. When she looked up and met his eyes, her smile flickered. It wasn't fear exactly, but the kind of recognition one sees in a bird when it senses the wind changing direction. That night, he checked the rifle. Polished it out of habit. Not threat, but readiness. 2 days later they came. 4 riders, 3 familiar from town and 1 unfamiliar with a scar down the side of his neck and a long, snake-eyed silence. They didn't ride like lawmen. They rode like debt collectors with something personal to settle. They came slow, dust trailing behind them like dirty silk. He stepped out to meet them, unarmed but not empty-handed. His hat was pulled low. His boots planted firm. The girls watched from inside. He could feel their stillness behind the door. The one with the scar did the talking. Come to collect property, Sam. He didn't blink. They're not property. Scar man leaned on his saddle horn. You speak Chinese now? I speak what's right. A chuckle from one of the others. They ain't supposed to be here, and we got the bill says so. One of them pulled out a crumpled slip of paper, waved it like it was scripture. The cowboy didn't move. This paper mean nothing here, he said. They were left to die. You left 'em. The man with the scar shrugged. And you picked 'em up like strays. But strays still belong to someone. His jaw tightened. The porch boards creaked behind him. You come to burn my house? Scar man smirked. We just came to talk. But they didn't dismount. And he didn't trust talk from men who carried matches in their pockets. Go on, he said, voice low. The horses shifted. A beat passed like a drawn breath. We'll be back, Scarman said. With more. You don't get to decide what belongs to who. They rode off slow. Like they owned the time. That night he didn't sleep. Neither did she. The quiet girl sat by the hearth, sewing with fingers steady as snowfall. She didn't ask what had been said, but she placed her hand gently on his forearm as he stoked the fire. That was enough. He spoke in pieces. They're coming again. She nodded once. He hesitated. Then reached into his pocket and brought out the cloth. It was warm from his hand. He laid it between them on the table. I don't know what this means, he said softly. But if you stay, I'll protect what you give. Her eyes lifted to his, wet, but not weak. I stay. It wasn't just a word. It was a seed. The next day, he fixed the fence. Repaired the hinges on the door. Moved the girls' sleeping mats closer to the hearth, away from windows. The quiet one helped him measure out powder. Neither spoke of what they were doing. Sometimes love looks like labor. Sometimes it's the way you prepare for a fight you don't want to have, simply because someone behind you needs to sleep without fear. At dusk, the barn caught fire. It happened fast. No voices. No warning. Just flames clawing up the dry beams like red hands. The girls screamed. He ran barefoot through the dirt, hose in one hand, the rifle slung over his shoulder. The water barely mattered. The fire had already decided. But they fought it anyway. The girls brought pails. The quiet one wrapped her dress and soaked it, beating at sparks. He shouted instructions, barely heard over the roar. In the end, they saved the corral. But the barn was gone. The horses scattered but unhurt. They stood there, faces lit by the glow of what had been. Smoke curling into the stars. He turned to her, chest heaving. She was covered in soot, hair matted, eyes wild but clear. He didn't ask. She didn't wait. She took his hand. Pressed it to her heart. "Still stay," she whispered. He closed his eyes. For once, he wished he had more than words. They slept close that night. The girls curled together like birds. The cowboy sat with the rifle across his lap, the cloth of blue cranes tucked into his shirt. At dawn, hoofbeats again. Not 4 this time, 6. He stood. Something had to end. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge when the horses came back, 6 this time, just as he'd expected. They moved like a line of thunderclouds across the dirt, grim and heavy, the riders too quiet for the noise they carried inside them. The scarred man rode at the front again, hat pulled low, eyes meaner than before. Behind him, new faces, one with a shotgun across his lap, another chewing something like he didn't care what the day brought. They came for what they believed was theirs, forgetting, or perhaps never knowing, what it cost to belong to yourself. The girls were already inside. He told them what to do if they came again. Stay low. Don't run. Don't speak unless spoken to. He didn't tell them he'd killed to keep them safe, though he knew they understood it already. The quiet one had wrapped the cloth of blue cranes around her wrist like a vow. He stood on the porch, rifle resting against his leg. He was calm, too calm, like someone who'd already made peace with whatever might happen next. Scar Man dismounted this time. Stepped forward with boots that crunched hard against the dry earth. "I warned you, Sam." "You did. I came civil, like a man ought to. But you think you're better than the rest of us. You think rules don't apply." "No," the cowboy said. "I just think some rules are wrong." Scar Man smiled without warmth. "You really want to die for girls who don't even speak your name?" From behind the curtain, the music box played one crooked note. Then another. The tune was faint, like memory being pulled from a well. The cowboy didn't blink. "Ain't about who says my name. It's about who gets to live without being chained." Scar Man nodded. "All right then." The man behind him cocked the shotgun. Another shifted his horse toward the side of the cabin, trying to flank. The cowboy raised his rifle, not hurried, not trembling. Just certain. "This doesn't have to go this way," he said. "Too late," Scar Man replied. A crack split the morning. A single shot. Wood splintered near the window. The youngest girl screamed. The cowboy fired back, hitting the ground near the rider's boots, not a kill, but a warning. Another shot followed, this one grazing the porch post. The air exploded into motion. And then, from the house, the door swung open. The quiet girl stepped out. She walked slowly, barefoot, her dress ash-stained and torn at the hem. In her hands she held the music box, cranked open, the melody trembling like breath in winter. Her voice followed it, quiet, deliberate. A song in a language none of them understood, yet somehow all of them heard. Her eyes locked on the scarred man, and she sang with her whole chest, not to charm, not to beg, but to declare. The other girls stepped out behind her, shoulders straight, faces calm. Together they stood as if rooted in the earth, not trophies, not prisoners, but people. Scar Man didn't speak. The singing unmoored something inside him, and he didn't know what to do with it. His fingers twitched toward his holster. "Don't," the cowboy said. Behind them, hooves pounded. Another rider approached fast, older, heavier, the sheriff. He pulled hard on the reins, dust swirling as he dismounted. "What the hell is this?" he barked. The scarred man stepped back, face red, caught between fury and retreat. "They're mine, by paper," he hissed. The sheriff looked at the girls. Then at the cabin. Then at the cowboy. "You know what folks say, Sam?" "I do." "You understand if I take your side, I'll have hell to pay." "I do." The sheriff took off his hat. Rubbed the back of his neck like a man remembering a favor from too long ago. He looked at the quiet girl, at the cloth wrapped around her wrist, and then at the music box still playing its stubborn melody. "Funny thing," he muttered. "My ma used to hum that tune. Learned it from a woman who cooked at the rail camps. Chinese. Kind soul. He turned to Scar Man. You got your paper. But you don't got your humanity. This ain't a claim you're making, it's a mistake. Scar Man spat in the dirt. This isn't over. Yes, it is, the sheriff said. If I see you on this land again, I'll have you in irons. The men didn't argue. Not out loud. But the way they turned their horses was heavy with hate. The cowboy watched them go, not relaxing, not blinking, until they vanished into the bend of the hills. Silence held like a fragile thing. Then the youngest girl let out a laugh, high, breathless, disbelieving. The quiet girl turned to him. She walked down the steps and placed the music box on the porch railing. She looked up into his eyes and touched her wrist, then his heart. He didn't speak. Just nodded. Later, under the apricot tree, they stood again. No preacher. No crowd. Just sky and soil and the scent of blossoms. The sheriff stood as witness, arms crossed. The girls circled them, holding candles made from melted soap and thread. The cowboy took her hands. She whispered something in her language. He didn't ask what it meant. He knew. They lived quietly after that. One of the girls left to teach children in a nearby mining town. Another found work as a cook. The youngest stayed, free now to laugh whenever she pleased. The apricot tree bore fruit that year. Sweet and round, full of sun. At night, the music box still played, sometimes broken, sometimes clear. Sometimes love arrives not like thunder, but like a soft hand placed on your chest, reminding you you're alive. In a land where ownership had become the law, they built something else, something gentler, harder to define, but real. And when the wind rose through the grass, it no longer sounded like warning. It sounded like peace.